Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSCAI's podcast series on the Commission's work. At the beginning of March this year, the Commission issued its final report to the President and Congress outlining its recommended strategy for winning in the artificial intelligence era. This week, I speak to NSCAI staff Lance Lantier, Justin Lynch, and Ryan Carpenter about how the 1986 Goldwater Nichols Act that reorganized the U.S. military inspired the Commission's recommendations to reorganize the Department of Defense to drive adoption of emerging and disruptive technological capabilities. I hope you find the conversation as significant as I did. Can we start with introducing each of you?
My name is Lance Lantier. I'm a director of research and analysis with the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. I happen to be active duty detail lead from the Navy, although my views that I expressed today reflect my own personal views, not those of the Navy, just myself as a staffer and my experience.
And Justin?
I'm Justin Lynch. I'm also a director of research and analysis at the National Security Commission on AI. I work on the workforce team. In my previous careers, I've been active duty military before transferring to the Guard, and then health staffer as well.
I'm Ryan Carpenter. I'm a director of research and analysis with NSCAI.
Okay. Can one of you talk about what the Goldwater Nichols Act is and how it inspired the recommendations in Chapter 2 of the Commission's final report?
Sure, I can talk about it. So the Goldwater Nichols Act, just to be brief, brought about sweeping changes to the way the U.S. military forces were organized in response to inter-service rivalries. So over time, this act led to changes in how we trained and educated our military with joint professional military education, as well as the joint qualification system. Requirements for commissioned officers to be educated and experienced in a joint matter was codified as part of the Goldwater Nichols Act of 1986. We believe that a model similar to this system that came out of the original Goldwater Nichols Act could similarly be used to create an emerging and disruptive technology code billet structure in the Department of Defense.
Okay, and just to be clear for those who are reading the report, you don't call out Goldwater Nichols in the report, but the recommendations were inspired by Goldwater Nichols. And could you explain what problems in the current structure, particularly related to AI and national security, the so-called Goldwater Nichols 2.0 recommendations attempt to solve?
Yeah, and just for people who are going to read the report, that's creating emerging technology critical billets. We think of AI as a decision-making factory where it's going to industrialize decision-making the same way that during the 19th and 20th centuries, the United States and many other places industrialized manufacturing by regularizing and automating the manufacturing process, increasing the speed, volume, and quality of a lot of their products, all while reducing their cost. So AI can do the same thing for decision-making as long as we build and effectively use the systems needed, just like we built the factories and trained workers for industrialized manufacturing. Within that context of industrializing decision-making and making thousands and thousands of decisions in the time and with the effort it took to make a much, much smaller number, we wanted to make sure that we have that infrastructure in place. And for Chapter 2, our commissioners believed that it was important for warfighters, not the technical workforce that's really hands on keyboard, but everybody else in uniform to have 5 areas of capabilities. The ability to make data-informed decisions as opposed to intuitive decision-making, computational thinking, or the ability to break down problems into sub-problems and understand how to use information processing agents to solve some of them, human-machine teaming, a culture where they're experimenting things. And then what's especially relevant for today is organizational transformation, the ability to shape organizational goals, objectives, processes, create your workforce, make resourcing decisions, things like that. in a way that it helps take you from where you are today to where you want to be in the future. In this case, an AI-enabled system, which our commissioners have said they believe is necessary by 2020. So as the DoD continues to incorporate emerging tech into its business operations, workforce, and the battlefield, it's really important that they acquire the talent necessary and maintain the fungible skill sets associated with introducing and fielding emerging technologies within its officers' corps. Now, there's some challenges with doing this. There's a lot for senior NCOs to do already, and it's really hard to meet those demands, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. But one of the things that people focus on a lot is education and then culture change. You can talk about culture change all day, but it's really hard to actually assess culture change most of the time. And it's really hard also to figure out what levers to pull to drive culture change. Is it a leadership challenge? Is it a resource challenge? What do we mean when we say, let's change culture? So instead of looking at culture change, we decided to look at a root cause of that and say, let's change incentives instead. As Ryan mentioned, Goldwater Nichols did a really great job changing the incentive structure for the officer corps to incentivize joint competency. So let's look at that as a model to change the incentive structure for digital literacy and emerging tech literacy. So we think that by changing that incentive structure, we could create emerging tech literate leaders who could assist with the acquisition of emerging tech, help it integrate it into field units, and develop organizational and operational concepts that integrate them as well, much more quickly than we do today.
And how would that work in practice?
Yeah, so much like the original Goldwater Nichols Act and the FY 2007 National Defense Authorization Act, both of which led to the joint qualification system that we have today in this current form, we believe this all starts with Congress. And we specifically recommended that the Armed Services Committees use the FY 22 National Defense Authorization Act to require that the Office of Personnel Management create billets for emerging technology within the Department of Defense. That's where it starts, the legislation. Then the Department of Defense, and specifically the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, can define emerging and disruptive technologies. That was tying back to some of our earlier recommendations that are in the final report, where we specifically said that there should be a technology annex to the National Defense Strategy and that USD R&D should play a bigger role, including with the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Once you have that structure and the legislation that forces the structure, you can get these billets put in place. And these billets would include, but not be limited to, positions that develop military doctrine and the operating concepts Justin was talking about, the positions within the force structure, resources and assessment directorates, the positions within the force development directorates, and leadership positions at the operational and tactical levels within the military services. And there's a place for these kinds of billets all the way down to the tactical edge. But all of this requires a formal, established process that leads people to become emerging tech certified.
So each of these billets would be for emerging tech certified officers, is that right? And how would an officer become certified?
That's right. Once the Undersecretary of Defense of Research and Engineering identifies what are the emerging and disruptive technologies that the department should be focusing on, then officers can be assigned to rotational experience tours that align with those priority areas. These rotation areas could be emerging tech-focused fellowships, emerging tech-focused talent exchanges, or other emerging tech-focused positions within government. And they should include completion of educational courses that are focused on emerging and disruptive technologies, including commercial certifications. So while our commission's recommendations did not specifically lay this out, and we didn't put the details for this, one could expect that DoD would maintain flexibility to formally establish both department-level requirements that apply across the entire department, but also allow for services to have their own service-specific or position-specific supplemental requirements that they can add to. And ultimately, this emerging and disruptive tech certification process has to be this formal process with the formal requirements, just like our joint qualification system does today. The process can't be as simple as, hey, you get a STEM degree, you're automatically considered emerging and disruptive tech certified, one and done.
Why doesn't the proposal include STEM graduate degrees as a way to become certified?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So STEM graduate degrees is not exactly the obvious choice for the way to become certified, but it's certainly a choice that came to the forefront of a lot of people's minds. But what we tried to do is look at the department's requirements as a whole, not just for emerging tech and not just for AI. And certainly one of the challenges we've seen over the last 20 years is that the department's put a lot of time and effort into trying to help leaders become better strategic thinkers as they advance. And I haven't seen any arguments that that's a problem that they've managed to solve already. There's been improvements, but it's not a problem that they've solved. One of the main tools that they've used is putting people through graduate programs at some of the professional military education schools, but then also their advanced level schooling in civilian schools. That's been helpful in a lot of ways. And what we don't want to do is take a step forward in emerging tech and then take a step backward elsewhere. And we think it's possible to balance those two a little bit by having emerging tech certification come through, fellowships, things like that Lance just mentioned, commercial certifications that don't require cutting strategy-focused programs. We also don't want to create a reliance on doing a STEM graduate program and then never looking back to emerging technology over the next 10 years. And that'd be problematic for a couple of reasons. The biggest being, of course, that tech is changing really fast. If you look at the state of AI 10 years ago versus the state of AI today, you're looking at a very, very different world because of the way hardware has changed, the way access to data has changed, and to some extent, the way some of the algorithms have changed in the last 10 years. And we're sure 10 years from now that we'll say the same thing, that many things have changed. So we don't want to have a static body of knowledge. Master's degrees don't necessarily indicate that, but we don't want to have that one touch point.
And would this then, for certification, would there be a cohesive course or process that everybody who gets certified would go through so everyone has the same level of knowledge, or you can assume that everyone has the same level of knowledge if they're certified? And then will you require recertification? As you said, technology changes quickly every 2 or 3 or 5 years.
So our recommendation does not have a single course that everyone would go through. And it's worth noting that the joint qualification system has some pieces like that, but joint billets aren't all the same experience either. They're very, very diverse. So we'd want to capture that same type of diversity experience through a broad array of commercial certifications, through a broad array of different fellowships. And there's a few benefits that would come from that. One is that you have different professional type backgrounds and organizational roles. Somebody who's working in a place that's focused on data architecture or marketing is going to offer something different to the Department of Defense than somebody who's working in a different field. The other part is you want to make sure that you're hitting a broad swath of emerging tech, not having everybody focus on data science or everybody focus on artificial intelligence, but still getting enough depth in your field.
Each of the different services can accomplish getting joint qualifications differently. There's not just one place to go to. There's not just one course that you take. There's a variety of places that offer it. We did not prescribe, as Justin said, in our recommendation, that level of specificity as to how exactly this must take place, nor the level of detail that must go in those courses. But the recommendation begins with that USDRNE laying out what the emerging and disruptive technologies are. And as quickly as those change, I think will determine the periodicity at which people will need to get recertified, especially as new things come to light that they weren't originally certified on. And so that will have to come and be looked at on an annual basis to say, is what we're producing, is what we're providing correct for what we originally intended? And we did not provide that in our recommendation.
Maybe you can give me an example of a billet that would require a certification. And then does the kind of certification have to match that particular billet? Or anybody who's certified can fill that billet and then figure out from there what they need to know?
Our recommendation is written so that the certification is fungible right now. So anybody who's certified could serve in a billet. There's some challenges to that, but we also don't want to overwhelm the personnel system with having to build everybody to fit very specific billets along the way. That's going to be very, very challenging. We would like as close alignment as possible between skill set and experience in the next job, but we don't want to try to put too much of a burden. The other piece of this is the joint qualification process works through a point system where you have to have a certain number of points based off of your time in joint billets in classes and things like that. So by saying we're not recommending a unified class that everybody has to go through, it shouldn't be interpreted as there's no standards. It's just you have to get to a certain number of points based off of the amount of time you spend in fellowships, the commercial certifications or certifications. And so there's a standard that's still there.
If you get too specific to the exact technology that a person needs to have to serve in a specific billet, the personnel system will come crushing underneath those requirements. It isn't built that way. Now, where this gets a little tricky is that when we're talking about emerging disruptive technologies, these folks need to have a breadth of understanding of emerging disruptive technologies and have certifications that make them the experts that they need to be able to inform the data-driven decision makers and the processes that we've talked about in some of our recommendations to date. They have to be able to walk into that position and have a breadth of knowledge when they come into that to help inform the process. but having a very specific niche skill set, something that potentially could be done by a command. I just think it becomes harder and harder to fill if they try to get that specific. A lot of really, really smart people already in the employ of the United States government, the national labs, don't get touch points with folks on the tactical edge. And the bridge between what the warfighter needs and what they can do in the labs is simply missing. When you start taking people that are officers in the military and rotating them into these labs as part of this type of certification process, or rotating them into industry and seeing what the off-the-shelf capabilities are that exist, you will get innovative things that will happen there and touch points and bridges that currently don't even exist, because that natural bridging just doesn't take place. As you rotate people that have been in a certain domain into a place where technology exists in the back end of the domain, they bring with them the knowledge of both. And they can inform decision makers, they can inform leaders that are in the positions to make those decisions in ways that they can't do so today, because that simply is not part of the natural DNA of how we rotate officers.
You started talking about incentives. Does this certification or filling these billets open you up for advancement that you wouldn't be open to otherwise?
So, Craig, I would just go back to the Goldwater Nichols because it was controversial at the time. Making promotions dependent on joint service and joint qualification was not popular. We believe that we're going to be more dependent on technology, not less dependent on technology. And those senior military leaders who will be guiding careers, who will be acquiring the latest technology, need to be conversant in the latest technology. We want this to be mandatory for emerging tech and AI to have a joint billet. Otherwise, you're just not going to get promoted. You need to be qualified in a specific field in order to be promoted. When you're in charge of buying stuff, you can get bamboozled pretty easily if people don't know what they're talking about. You have to be conversant in this stuff. Senior military leaders have to have a baseline understanding, and it has to be more than a weekend course at MIT. You actually had to be conversant. And so why would we wait until we have some catastrophe where we need to adapt to this? We want to get ahead of this so that we can have our senior military folks really at the cutting edge of technology and guiding those organizations in a way that would help them maintain our technological advantage. The United States has maintained the technological edge for the last 70 years. We have been at the front, and we want to maintain that edge.
And assuming that these recommendations are implemented, does that mean that over time, all senior officers in the services will have this emerging and disruptive tech certification, or that they better get it if they want to advance?
We don't know yet is the quick answer. We certainly have that option available in the recommendations, and hearkening back to Goldwater Nichols as many times as we have when we're pushing this recommendation certainly implies that that's a strong possibility. But we also didn't want to force the services hands too aggressively on this for the reasons that we described before, where there's so many requirements for leaders in continuing education already. We want to make sure that we come in and have an opportunity for the department to start doing this in really critical fields and then grow it and grow the critical billets, grow how many people are going through the emerging tech certification over time. So there are absolutely some billets that need that right away, and those are not unambitious billets that we've listed. Operational concept development, force development, a lot of the senior leaders from tactical positions, especially at the 2 and 3 star level. But we haven't gone the direction of saying that the Congress should tell the department they shall do this for every general officer, flag officer yet. And that might be a possibility as they collect feedback about how well it's worked over time. Goldwater Nichols did evolve over time as well, as Ryan mentioned in the beginning.
Does this require congressional action, or is it something the services will be able to do on their own? I would guess there would be some resistance if it's left to the services, because there will be mid-career or late-career officers that don't want to go through the certification. And this isn't a simple certification. I mean, it takes some real concentration and brain power. So is it going to require congressional action?
We chose to go the congressional route for a couple of reasons. First is for the permanency of it. The Department of Defense is under tremendous pressure just running the military services in the Pentagon, and there's competing requirements and priorities in a yearly budgeting cycle. There's not a lot of flexibility, and there's a lot of focus there on day-to-day. And I think that by Congress making this a priority, it actually helps set priorities for the services. Also, There's a lot of turnover on civilians within the Pentagon, and Congress can see the overarching picture. And so I think it's helpful to have Congress move in this way. And legislation places a mandate on the department, much like the original Goldwater Nichols Act, that would help eliminate some of the expected bureaucratic resistance and help set priorities for the services. I cannot emphasize enough that we believe this issue requires urgent attention. And legislation would be the fastest path to seeing the department and individual services move on this recommendation and build lasting requirements with permanency.
And you've presumably been in communication with the congressional committees. Are people receptive to this? And what is the attitude toward this in the services? Has there been anything like this since Goldwater Nichols that would really reorient the military overall?
We've spoken with people on the Hill about this. I don't want to go into any detail about it, except to say that there is interest on the Hill. In terms of the Department of Defense, the majority of the reaction we've seen about this so far has come from mid-career professionals, not senior leaders. And mid-career professionals have been very, very interested in the idea. A lot of them have worked on doing things like commercial certifications and learning about artificial intelligence, data science, other digital fields in their own time. So the idea of having more and more senior leaders who are responsible for making resourcing decisions, for managing talent, things like that, that understand the building blocks of what they need to do is something that excites a lot of people. There's some bias because we work with people who are already excited about artificial intelligence and integrating new tools into DoD, but there's been some excitement there.
When people talk about defense reform, Goldwater Nichols is typically seen as the last large reorganization legislation. It is, people widely see this as a successful piece of legislation. And so there really isn't one within the past 30 years that you could say is comparable to this level of adjustment.
It sounds like a very major change to the way the military is organized. And it didn't jump out at me when I read the report. And admittedly, I didn't read it as closely as the people who have written it. But is it just that there are many recommendations of this scale?
It is pretty prominent in the training and education section. Just one of the numerous things that we think needs to happen in the training and educating of warfighters. It is not going to fundamentally change the organization of the department or the services the way a Goldwater Nichols did, because Goldwater Nichols suddenly placed a requirement on services to take out of their own inventory officers who would go into billets that didn't necessarily serve those services, and basically drew from a fixed inventory that left them with gaps. And there was a lot of resistance to that. How this becomes instantiated through the legislation doesn't necessarily have to be a reorganizational structure change like that. That said, this is one of a number of recommendations that we believe fundamentally change the way that we train and educate both civilians and military, because we have looked at the problem not just looking at the military side, but also from civilians. We have put forth recommendations about a United States Digital Service Academy, establishment of a National Reserve Digital Corps. We have put things forward for the K through 12 STEM education all the way through university in the National Defense Education Act 2. This is one of a number of these large things, all of which on the back end, by the way, you need to have career paths and careers established for these personnel to be able to actually do a career in their respective piece, either government, civilian, or military, in order to not lose them and have them either leave at the end of their obligated service time or simply leave whenever their ability allows them to go out to industry or somewhere else and simply leave government service. So if you look at the whole package, you see a number of things that we've gone after approaching education, civilians, military, part-time, full-time, technical, non-technical, talent and workforce. There's a lot here. There's so much we think needs to change with urgency that one might simply miss it, which is one of the reasons that we want to do the podcast.
One other thing that would be helpful to highlight is that we shouldn't downplay the importance of senior leadership for organizational transformation, for integrating AI, and for becoming AI ready by 2025. Most of the people that we speak with will tell us that tech talent is incredibly important and essential. But when they talk about the biggest obstacle they face in terms of workforce and talent, it's educating senior leaders. It's not actually bringing in tech talent, though that's a huge issue. They say, if I could solve one problem tomorrow, it would be senior leader education. So if you want to bring in tech talent more effectively, one of the things you need to do is educate senior leaders. If you want to make sure resources are going the right direction, you need to educate senior leaders. If you name a problem in DoD, having senior leaders understand the best way to solve that problem is a huge step towards solving it. So that's a lot of what this is trying to accomplish, is equipping senior leaders with the tools that they need now and that they'll need 10 years from now that weren't as necessary 20 years ago. And so that's why we think that pipeline needs to change.
How long do you expect certification would take an individual?
It depends on the route that they go. If someone wants to go the commercial certification route, then you might be talking about months, but that not as a full-time job. Some of my friends who are earning commercial certifications of the type that we're envisioning are doing that on the side in addition to their full-time job and doing that over the course of 3 or 4 months. Say like a commercial certification in cloud architecture or cloud artificial intelligence. If it's something that involves a fellowship in industry, I think 6 months to 1 year is the time frame that we're looking at.
And let's assume that this Congress does act on this for fiscal year 2022. How long before you have an officer corps that is certified and educated at the level that you believe they need to be educated? Is this a generational change that we're talking about or something faster than that?
I definitely don't think it's a generational change. It's worth taking a moment and looking back at the full suite of recommendations we have for train and educate warfighters. We have integrating computational thinking and digital skills into junior officer or pre-commissioning requirements, initial training, and non-commissioned officer education courses. So that's helping the new people that come in, and that could go in very quickly and start having an effect. There's integrating emerging technology into professional military education, which could also go into effect pretty quickly as well. And then there's the Goldwater Nichols piece of it as well, in addition to the things that have already been enacted by Congress. So looking at that full suite, we see that DoD and then the services could actually start touching people at various points in their career, throughout their entire career, right away. So you don't have to wait for a generation to take place. So how long would it take to have junior officers and CEOs start understanding the equipment they're using much more effectively? That could take place just about as quickly as they start actually building those courses, getting licensing agreements of the existing courses if they choose to take that route, and then integrating that into requirements. Same thing for Goldwater Nichols 2.0, where they could start adding that requirement and then moving people into fellowships, into non-critical billets, requiring commercial certifications. That could happen very quickly. So I think having this as part of DoD's culture in a very robust way and having new capabilities in our workforce could easily happen by the 2025 timeframe that our commissioners have recommended.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Lance, Justin, and Ryan for their time. I encourage everyone who cares about the future of our world to read the National Security Commission on AI report, which can be found at www.nscai.gov. Regardless of how you feel about military uses of AI, I believe it's critical that people involved in the field understand what the government is doing. The singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world, so pay attention.